Welcome. Thanks for braving the snow to be here tonight. I'm really excited about this event. So I'm going to say a few words about my broader research program to give you an idea of why I got here and why I started looking into piracy and pirate organizations. What I do at Ivey is I do research and I do teaching. So I teach the core strategy course in the HBA program. So I guess some of you have gone through that program, if I understood well. And my research activities are centered around the study of socially contested organizations. If you remember the very core notion in strategic management, it's all about understanding how businesses create value, capture value, and distribute value. And this is a really good framework to actually analyze businesses and understand how value is created. The question I'm asking in my research program is, how do we get to decide what is a legitimate way of creating value, of capturing value, and of distributing value? So it's actually kind of easy to do that once the rules of the game have been set. But who gets to decide what the rules of the game are? Who gets to decide if you are legitimately creating value, distributing value, capturing value? And this is really what my research is about. So I'm going to give you a few examples of what I mean by that. I'm going to walk you through the main arguments of the book. And I'll keep the Q&A for later. But if you think you're too shy to ask questions later, or you're afraid you're going to forget about the questions, you can actually tweet them using this hashtag, and I'll check the Twitter account later. So then you can create a stockpile of questions for later. This is completely experimental. I've never done this before, but we'll see if it works. Okay, so I'm going to give you a few examples of what I mean by what is legitimate when you create value, capture value, distribute value. If you think of products that corporations manufacture and sell, or services, I'm going to take two examples. Generic drugs. So in many respects, generic drugs are really good because it allows people to get treatments at a lower cost. And it's exactly the same. It's the identical product, the same as the branded drug, but it's a lot cheaper. So many people think it's a great idea. But how do you get to decide which treatments allow for the existence of generic drugs, or in which countries they should be available, or after how many years they should be available after the patent has been created? And this is where the notion of legitimacy is really important. Some people will say, well, generic drugs should be available immediately when people need them. Otherwise, they're going to die or they're going to be ill. Other people will say, well, we need to recover our investment, so we need to wait 10, 20, maybe 30 years before generic drugs are available, and we should be able to maintain our patents for a long period of time. And depending on the country, depending on the treatment, depending on the drug, the criteria for legitimacy will differ. Now, take the example of VCR, video cassette recorders. So this is a very interesting device that was invented, put together over a few years, but that became available for mass markets in the late 70s. Some people were very worried that video cassette recorders would destroy a lot of value, that they would actually destroy entire industries. And most of those people that were angry at VCRs were operating in the movie industry. And they were actually calling this machine a savage machine. And they tried to convince the US government that VCRs were illegitimate, that they were not a product that should be accepted by the broader civil society. And so they went to court, and they tried to convince people that VCRs should be forbidden because they were not a legitimate product to sell for mass consumption. You know the end of the story. They lost, but by the tiny little bit in the Supreme Court, they lost the vote, the final vote, by one vote. And VCRs became widely successful products, and they didn't destroy entire industries, as was predicted by some people. Now think about how the legitimacy of entire markets is determined. Think about these different ways of organizing markets. Free markets, regulated oligopolies, and the so-called natural monopolies. How does it work? Who gets to decide what's a free market? or whether a market should be organized with a regulated oligopoly or a monopoly. Well, things change over time. For many decades in the United States, for instance, the railway industry was considered a natural monopoly. The telecom industry was considered a natural monopoly, and a very huge corporation called AT&T that still exists today, and at the time it was the largest corporation in the world, was able to convince the US government for several decades that the telecommunication industry was a natural monopoly and there shouldn't be any competition there. But other markets have always been organized around the principle of free markets. But how do these rules come into existence? Who gets to decide about them? Now, think about the legitimacy of certain trade practices, such as below-cost pricing. How do we get to decide if it's allowed or not? How do we get to decide if it's a socially accepted practice, and in which industries and at which points in time? So in the fashion industry, there are certain moments in the year where you're allowed to do below-cost pricing. During the sales periods, in many countries, retailers are allowed to sell items below their costs to get rid of them. In other places, it's not allowed. Think about auctions. There's multiple ways you can auction products. In certain markets, it's going to be a legitimate way of selling products and services. In others, not. So I don't know if today I had gotten an email from one of you saying, "Look, I cannot afford $40 for tonight, but what if instead give you a bottle of Bordeaux? We do some barter. I'm not going to pay cash, but we can do some exchange." Well, I would have been shocked. I would have accepted it, of course, but I would have been shocked because it's not how it's supposed to work, right? So who gets to decide those rules? Think about now the legitimacy of entire industries, because these can change dramatically over time and across space as well. The banking industry, which is now a pretty legitimate industry, or I mean, maybe a minority would disagree, but it's a pretty legitimate industry. It hasn't always been the case. Actually, for centuries in Europe, the banking industry was illegitimate, and it didn't even exist because the church had decided that lending money with interest was not a socially acceptable practice. And so there was no banking industry because there was no interest rates. It was forbidden. Well, it was not forbidden, it was judged illegitimate. Think about the private military contracting industry. That's a very interesting example because it's been going back and forth. For centuries, it was actually how war was conducted. Governments would hire mercenaries, private organizations to conduct their wars. Then for about 200-300 centuries, it completely disappeared. The industry entirely disappeared. And in the last decade or so, since 9/11, particularly since the war in Afghanistan and in Iraq, there's been a renewal of the private military contracting industry, and it's become socially accepted again. So it's been going back and forth. It was really big, disappeared for 300 years, now it's back. Is it because people have found new ways to create value, capture value, distribute value in that industry? No, it's got nothing to do with that. It's all about the rules of the game. Think about the legitimacy of different partnerships. If you're going to partner with other organizations and build a cartel, in many industries, in many countries, it's going to be illegitimate. People are not going to accept that. Society is going to say, no, this is against the rules of fair competition, so you can't do that. But if you're doing patent pooling, in many industries, it's actually OK. Essentially, it's a cartel, but it's OK. So in many of the industries that belong to the so-called digital economy, you will find patent pooling. Actually, there's one very important organization that regulates cyberspace that is called the Worldwide Consortium, W3C, World Wide Web Consortium, sorry, which is essentially an organization that gathers about 300 major actors of the digital economy so that these people can meet and decide what are going to be the standards that everybody's going to use. And they decide, for instance, that XML standard will be used by this and that company and this and that type of technologies. They decide about the status of the MP3 standard, etc. All the standards that to most of us are relatively invisible, but that are needed to run cyberspace. And you've got these organizations that are going to share patents to make sure that they can all use the same standards. So this is socially accepted. Cartels in many industries are not, but essentially it's the same practice. Think about the legitimacy of certain actors in certain industries. So I actually wrote my dissertation about the global weapons industry. And If you think about this industry, it's very interesting. Many people think it's completely illegitimate, that this industry shouldn't even exist, because basically it's all about making money by selling weapons. And weapons are made to kill people and to wage war. So if you're an organization and you're selling weapons, basically you have a strong interest in having some wars going on around. And so many people think it's not socially acceptable. And so many people think that arms trade should be forbidden or restricted or constrained. But some organizations do not have this problem. They're not attacked so much. They don't have to face all these protests because they are based in countries that are just like peaceful countries that promote world peace, and that's okay to be there as an arms producers. There's 5 countries that play a particular role in this industry, and it's the countries that are permanent members of the United Nations Security Council. It turns out 80% of the world arms export come from those 5 countries that are supposed to make sure the peace is going to be maintained in the world. So if you look at this, products, markets, trade practices, whole industries, partners, particular actors, some of them are legitimate, socially accepted, some others are not. And I'm trying to find a way to explain this. And if you don't explain this, that even if you know how to create value, capture value, and distribute value, you're not going to go very far. And it's very likely that your businesses are not going to be very sustainable, because what happens if, at some point, the industry in which you have invested all your capital, all your innovation, is judged illegitimate? So I'm going to propose you 2 options to explain these different patterns. Option 1, if you look very carefully here, it's already on the screen, is the invisible hand. I found this picture because I thought that would be a bit cheap otherwise. So the invisible hand explains what's going on. There's like some market forces, price mechanism, fluctuations of supply and demand that explain why legitimacy patterns evolve over time across space, across industries. The other explanation, and that's the one that I'm going to develop today, is organization, the existence of organizations. So organizations are complex social systems that control resources, capabilities, and that try to achieve particular goals, objectives, using a strategy. Okay, that's where I circle back to my job. I teach strategy. Organizations can be on multiple types. They can be for-profit. They can be not-for-profit. They can be associations. They can be corporations. They can be unions. They can be consortiums. They can be government organizations. And some of them have acquired a lot of power. And I believe that some of the largest organizations today have a lot more power and influence than King Louis XIV in the 18th century. Have more power than the most powerful monarchs of the Middle Ages, have more power than Napoleon ever had. And these organizations, they have value systems. They develop their own norms. They develop their own worldviews. They develop their own technologies. And as they grow, all these things diffuse throughout the social fabric. When organizations grow, their values, their norms, their worldviews, their technologies diffuse. So in a way, you could see organizations as vehicles that convey social fabric, social systems. Okay, just like we as organisms are conveyors of DNA in genes. And as we reproduce, we spread that. Organizations do the same. Now, I'm going to give you 2 examples. Look at this excerpt from Facebook's IPO prospectus. So that's the document they used to attract investors last year. So what is striking here is that you would expect Facebook to say, look, we're a business, we're going to make a lot of money, you should invest in us because you're going to have a really good return on your investment. No, that's not what they say. They say, look, we're not a company, we're on a social mission, we're going to give people the power to share, we're going to transform many of our core institutions and industries. Sounds like a religion, right? Sounds like a religious project. They're going to transform society, okay? And they think that the world's information infrastructure should resemble the social graph. What you see here is like values, norms, worldviews. And yeah, they're going to use a technology to do that. But really, this is not a business mission. This is a social mission. This is a world philosophy that's being put into practice. Okay? Now look at this excerpt from the Electronic Frontiers Foundation's mission statement. So the Electronic Frontier Foundation is an activist organization that defends civil rights, civil liberties in cyberspace. And look at what they say. It's actually quite similar to what you could read in Facebook's IPO prospectus. They're on a social mission. They have very strong values. They declare certain industries obsolete. Facebook, they want to change them. They want to change core institutions in society. The Electronic Foundation, they just say, well, look, certain industries have become obsolete, and we're going to contribute to destroying them. Because what we want to do is this, and that goes against most of the stuff that these industries are doing. And this is a very powerful, very influential organization in the digital economy. They have grown really big. So normally, this is my job. I'm a management professor and researcher, so I study for-profit corporations, just as Facebook or Apple, and that's the name of the academic discipline that goes with management research. And but I've always been struggling with that. You know, when people ask me, "What do? You do management, right?" And I'm like, "Yeah, what is that? What is management?" Yeah, I know value creation, value distribution, value capture. I get that, but what about the rules of the game? I want to know. How come that an organization like Facebook is even legitimate today? It wouldn't have been legitimate 20 years ago. Maybe 10 years from now, it will have disappeared for reasons that have got nothing to do with the economic value it can generate. So this is how it's supposed to be. Management professors are examining, studying organizations that are legal and legitimate. Legal, they are like operating within the legal framework as provided by governments, and they are legitimate in the sense that they are doing things that are socially accepted. Okay? You would know organizations that do exactly the opposite of that are mostly illegal and mostly illegitimate. They are criminal organizations like Cosa Nostra, like the mafia. Okay? They are only legitimate in the eyes of those that they give money to, but the vast majority of society doesn't think these organizations are legitimate, and they're only doing illegal stuff. And the scholars that study those organizations are usually legal scholars. They have a very different perspective on what is interesting there. What I'm interested in is those two blank spots there. Organizations that are mostly legal but illegitimate, and organizations that are mostly legitimate but illegal. When I've got a name for those organizations, pirate organizations and Corsair organizations. Probably the two examples there, Nachi and Red Honker Union, you haven't heard of before, but I'm going to give some explanation about what that is. Typically, Corsair organizations are studied by political scientists and pirate organizations by historians and sociologists. So you would find historians who wrote the story of Blackbird and who wrote the history of the sea pirates of the 17th century. And they usually tell those stories as if they were tales for children. Okay, like, look, this was fun. This was the 17th century. There was this bunch of guys. They were doing these things, and they were heroes, and they were Robin Hoods, and that's all we know. And some sociologists today are starting to write about Anonymous and WikiLeaks from a different perspective. But so the reason why I'm struggling with the idea that I'm a management scholar is because I want to understand how these different types of organizations interact to make the rules of the game change in different industries across time and across space. I think we need to understand how these different groups interact to understand how the rules of the game change. We need to understand why, at some point, certain ways of creating value, distributing value, become legitimate or illegitimate. And so I define myself more as a social scientist. These are all social sciences, okay? I don't care if I'm drawing on sociology or economics or political science to explain what I want to explain. I just want to explain it. So to give you an overview of what I mean by pirate organization, I have decided that I wouldn't be talking. I'm going to show you a short movie. I'm going to explain where this movie comes from later. But it's a movie that was released about 2 months ago. I produced it. I didn't direct it. It was made by a young and promising director based in the UK called Daniel Wyatt. And this movie was not meant to be seen by academics or by business executives. It's a movie that was meant to talk to a much broader audience. Typically people who wouldn't be working in for-profit corporations, or people who wouldn't necessarily be interested in reading such a book. So you're not in the target audience for the movie. So just a warning, the movie is intentionally provocative and is simplifying a lot of the stuff that I'm going to say today. But I'm still going to show it to you.
SOPA was a bill to give the US government the right to block access to any website it deemed to be in breach of copyright law. Opposing this American plan to create a state cyber police were such online platforms as Anonymous, Wikipedia, Reddit, 4chan, and DeviantArt. Many governments see cyberspace as a sovereign territory that should be under state control. But to organizations like Anonymous, cyberspace is a public good that cannot be owned or centrally controlled. Acts of piracy have always been a response to the control of uncharted capitalist frontiers. Piracy is not a random act. It is predictable and lies at the core of capitalism. The conflict over the control of cyberspace is just the latest in a long history of struggles. It all began in the 17th century when capitalism expanded into the first uncharted territory, the high seas. The European states were competing for ownership of trade routes. To impose their own rules, they created monopolies called the East India Companies. The Dutch version, known as the VOC, was designed to rule over the trade routes the Dutch had discovered. For the Dutch, both competing companies and indigenous merchants were considered pirates. But why? From the state's point of view, anyone not respecting the standards imposed by the ruler is a pirate. So piracy is a matter of perspective, and those in power tend to impose their own perspective on the rest of the world. That's why the Dutch government saw nothing wrong when in 1603 a Dutch admiral attacked a Portuguese ship along the spice route. In fact, the Dutch government had sanctioned the attack by providing a letter of marque and reprisal. Those given this authority were known as privateers or corsairs. So what the Portuguese considered an act of piracy was, for the Dutch, a valiant move in forcing control of a sea route they claimed to own. Many pirates believed the high seas to be a public good, to be used freely for the benefit of everyone. But in uncharted territories, it is unclear who the legitimate owners are and who the pirates are. Stories of pirates are not unique to Hollywood tales of a bygone era. History repeats itself whenever capitalism expands into uncharted territory, and that includes cyber and outer space. So Johnny Depp won't be out of work anytime soon. In the early 20th century, the British government created a monopoly to enforce rules in the latest capitalist territory, the airwaves, and the BBC was born. Its purpose was to create rules for programmers and for listeners, such as allowing only religious shows and classical music. His Majesty's subjects were to listen to the broadcasts in silence, using only BBC-approved receivers. But the popularity of offshore pirate radio made the government rethink the rules of broadcasting. And since the end of the BBC's monopoly in 1967, the airwaves have been free of censorship and treated as a public good. The funny thing is, every time capitalism expands into new territories, state monopolies are used to define the rules and gain control. Or did you actually believe that capitalism and free markets were one and the same thing? Today, the issue of net neutrality in cyberspace echoes the struggles for freedom of the seas and freedom of the airwaves. Remember the Dutch corsairs attacking the Portuguese ship? Well, in 2001, the Chinese government authorized 10,000 cyber pirates turned cyber corsairs to attack American targets in reprisal for a US drone intrusion. Since then, both the US and China have been tracking cyber pirates online to offer them jobs as cyber corsairs. Using cyber weapons such as the Stuxnet and flame viruses, cyber corsairs fight for control over cyberspace, a strategic territory on which so many industries depend. So ask yourself, who shall we trust to control cyberspace? A for-profit like Google, sometimes backed by the NSA? A non-profit like ICANN, supported by the US government? Or a collective of stateless cyber activists like Anonymous? Clearly, we owe multiple pirate organizations for their view of the sea as a common good, for unleashing free radio broadcasting, and for defending net neutrality. Some say that sea pirates were the only ones accepting women on board in the 17th century. Thank you, guys. But the story is not over. Capitalism has entered a new age of expansion, and gene maps and outer space are the new uncharted territories of the 21st century. Who will you trust to control them?
So if we're trying to provide a definition of piracy, it's actually quite a difficult exercise. When I started doing research on piracy, I did what I always do when I have a question and I don't have the answer. I go and look into the United Nations conventions. And they have a definition of piracy there in the Convention of the Law of the Seas. And a pirate is someone committing illegal acts of violence or detention or any act of depredation for private ends on the high seas. That's what a pirate is according to international law, if that exists. I'm not quite sure if that exists. But I have several issues with this definition. The first one is, so I was playing this video game, and this is Lara Croft. And well, obviously she's like having an argument with her boyfriend or something on a ship. And they're fighting. And if I look at this definition of piracy, that would qualify. They're, acts of violence on a ship for private ends on the high seas. Those guys are pirates. Okay. Now, if I look at this, usually people, they think, well, if we want piracy to happen, there's going to be something that's stolen, right? You got to steal something, otherwise it's not piracy. Violence is not enough. So let's look at this other scene. Here you get two people breaking into a bank, and they're robbing the bank. They're stealing stuff. But if you look carefully at the picture, you will notice that they are not walking on water. They are walking on yellow tiles. And so that doesn't work on the high seas. So they're not pirates. They're stealing stuff, but because water is not under their feet, but yellow tiles, it doesn't qualify as piracy. And then I was wondering, what about pirate radio? What about digital piracy? What about biopiracy? I've heard about all these terms. And I was wondering, why do we use them if it's got nothing to do with piracy? And why would stealing something on the high seas would make you a pirate, and stealing something on land would just make you a bank robber? What difference does it make? It doesn't make sense to me. Now, I've had another issue. How do we know what's the difference between a pirate and a corsair? This guy is called Francis Drake. He was one of the biggest pirate/corsair of the 16th century. He started as a pirate. He was just attacking ships and stealing from those ships. But then he entered the Navy. He was working for the Queen, the British Queen. And she gave him one of those letters that you heard about in the movie, a letter of marque and reprisal, and he became a corsair. But of course, it's not a pirate, because once you get the letter, it's not illegal anymore what you're doing, because you get the letter from the Queen. She authorizes you to attack ships. As long as they're not British, it's fine. Okay? Any ship is fine, just not British ships. Then, from the point of view of the Queen, you're not an illegal guy anymore. You're fine. But then he was fed up and went back to piracy. He told the Queen, look, I'm fed up with you. I'm just going to attack whatever ship comes along. And actually, the British ships usually are loaded with gold, so it's a much better business for me. So he went back and forth. He had a pretty long career on the seas, went back and forth being a pirate, a corsair, pirate, corsair. And at the end of the day, he died in one of those attacks. And the Queen decided to knight him and became Sir Francis Drake. Now this guy, Mark Moffray, He was one of the most famous cyber pirates a few years ago. He was famous for attacking the Windows systems, Windows-based computers, hacking into them, and he was very good at it. And he destroyed a lot of computer systems. And at some point, he had a choice between going to jail or doing something else, and he decided to actually go into digital security. And now he's got his own firm. He's the chief technology officer of that firm, and he's working for governments. He's helping governments protect their security systems online. And I could multiply those examples. Basically, if you look at the career of any particular individual connected somehow to the pirate phenomenon, you will see that people go back and forth between being a pirate and being a corsair. So I thought, it doesn't make sense to look at those guys. Anyway, I don't believe, as I said earlier, that individuals can change the world anymore. This time is long gone. Now you need powerful organizations if you're going to want to make a difference. So instead, I thought it was better to look at the organizations in which they operate. When Francis Drake left his pirate crew to become a corsair for the Queen, the pirate crew remained, and he was replaced by someone else. And this pirate crew continued to be a pirate crew. And when he left the Queen to go back to being a pirate, the corsair organization created by the Queen remained. It was still there, it was still operating. It still had the same objectives, and it was still implementing the same strategy. So individuals may change jobs, but I don't care. I'm just going to look at the organizations that they work for and what they do, and what they change, and how they influence the course of things. So to define, to identify pirate organizations, you need a few things. The first thing you need is Uncharted Territory. Uncharted Territory is territory that has been recently discovered, explored, mapped, that is brand new, if you wish, and that has no rules yet. We don't know what rules apply in Uncharted Territory by definition, because we are just discovering it. And so the high seas in the 17th century were Uncharted Territory. As the navigation techniques improved and we started to travel between intercontinental travel on the high seas, new routes were opened, but there was no rules that could apply to those routes. So people were wondering, can someone legitimately claim ownership rights on those routes? Can I own the seas, or a particular portion of the seas? If I trade using these routes, how do we distribute the value that's generated? Does it go to the merchant? Does it go to the country from which the merchant originates? Or does it go to the first person that discovered the route, that explored the route, the explorer? How do we split the value? That's called Uncharted Territory. When we don't know that yet, or when people disagree about how we should handle these kind of issues, that's called Uncharted Territory. The airways in the early 20th century, same issue. Who get to control, who get to monitor what is being broadcast on the airwaves? When it was new, we were still experimenting with radio broadcasting technologies, the same questions were being asked. The same questions were being asked in cyberspace in the 70s, before the internet became a mass market thing, as we started to connect university networks and stuff like that in the United States. That was the origin of cyberspace. The same questions were asked, and they're still asked today. There's still no definitive rules, consensual rules about who owns what in cyberspace. The genome, since it was first mapped by the Human Genome Project in 2000, is actually experiencing the same process. Okay? Can we own gene sequences? Who owns them? The person that deciphered the sequence the first? Or do you need to modify it to be able to put a patent on it? Can we actually even patent a gene sequence? There's no rules yet. Countries disagree, United Nations disagree with the World Trade Organization, and it's Uncharted Territory. And soon, we'll have the same questions about outer space, but I'll show you a small case study about that later. So to have pirate organizations, you need Uncharted Territory. Then you need a sovereign. You need a sovereign state that wants to control those territories. You would need a sovereign like the Dutch Republic in the 17th century, which claimed that if a Dutch merchant was for the first time traveling between Amsterdam and Jakarta, then the sea route would belong to the Dutch, and no one else could use it. No one else could trade there. And they would essentially claim ownership right on the high seas. The same was true in the United Kingdom at the time of the BBC, when they were experimenting with radio broadcasting in the early 20th century. They didn't know how it worked yet. They knew there was something above the ground, and through that something, the airways were propagating and diffusing radio content. And they called that thing above the ground ether. It was a new territory, and they said, well, we want to control ether. It's just above the sovereign ground of the United Kingdom, and so it belongs to us. Okay? No one else can use it to broadcast programming unless we control it. And if you think of cyberspace today, many governments think that cyberspace should obey the same rules as ether in the 1920s, that actually cyberspace is not like this one unique territory, but it's actually a juxtaposition of national intranets that are protected by firewalls and filters. China has one, Iran has one, Australia has one, the United States has one. Okay? And the third thing that you need to have pirate organizations is state-supported monopolies. So the biggest one in the 17th and 18th century was the VOC, the Dutch East India Company. That's the acronym in Dutch. I won't try to pronounce it. It's very difficult. It was the largest multinational of the 17th century and the 18th century. It was a monopoly. It was created by the Dutch Republic to control exclusively the sea routes between the Netherlands and Southeast Asia. And it was also the first corporation in history with tradable shares. And actually, the Dutch government created the first stock exchange in history so that people, investors, could invest in the VOC and trade shares. And they created the Amsterdam Stock Exchange in the beginning of the 17th century for that purpose. The origin of the first stock exchange in history is not the invisible hand of whatever. It's a Dutch Republic. So it's the state that created a monopoly together with the first stock exchange to do one thing: gain exclusive control on a territory. Think of the BBC, another monopoly created in the mid-1920s by the United Kingdom, and it remained in power until the late 60s, and it was the only authorized radio broadcaster in the UK. Think about the history of cyberspace. AT&T had exclusive control. It was a natural monopoly in the telecommunication industry at the time in the US. Exclusive control for multiple years, several decades actually, on the communications. ICANN is the only organization that is in control of the high-level domain registration system of the internet. They control the root servers. It's an organization that is supposedly independent and not for profit, but it's actually connected to the FTC in the United States. And some people say that Google also is playing the role of the big monopoly of cyberspace these days, but I leave an interrogation mark there because I'm not sure yet. So once you have all these things, then as a government you can have centralized, have centralized rulemaking over a territory, and you can start enclosing this territory using multiple tools and devices, legal devices such as patents and exclusivity rights and copyrights. And then you can exclude all the people you don't want there. So the Dutch East India Company considered that all the indigenous merchants that had been trading in the area of Southeast Asia for decades before they arrived, at once they became pirates, and they became illegal. Foreign merchants from competing monopolies, from the Spanish monopoly, the Portuguese monopoly, or the British monopoly, were considered pirates as well. They were excluded from these sea routes because the Dutch claimed ownership there. The BBC excluded all the independent DJs and news channels from the radio broadcasting industries for about 40 years. And when you've set up national firewalls on the internet, you can exclude certain types of content. So the Australian government started by excluding child pornography. That was the reason why they put the filters. But then they decided that all sorts of content related to gambling should also be filtered out. And then certain types of cults or religions that would publish content on the internet should also be excluded from the Australian cyberspace, et cetera, et cetera. And they kept expanding the list of things that were filtered out. So once you set up all these things, everybody that doesn't respect the fences that you've put around, you can call them pirates, essentially. So piracy is a phenomenon that is produced by the very way the nation-state system works. Okay, so as nation-states set up fences around their territory upon which they claim exclusive sovereign rights, they can start to exclude organizations from that territory, and these organizations are called pirates. So here's a definition, tentative definition. Pirate organizations in uncharted territory contest centralized exclusive control by states and their monopolies. They propose alternative norms, emphasizing openness, transparency, free circulation, and the notion of common good. So that was something that was discussed in the movie you've just seen as well. So now we know a little bit more what is the pirate organization. I'm asking, when is the pirate organization? And I'm aware the syntax is not very good here, but I just like the question like this. So what's interesting is that pirate organizations do not appear coincidentally or accidentally. It's kind of predictable to know when pirate organizations are going to start growing and becoming more and more influential. And it's usually when capitalism is experiencing some massive revolution. The international trade revolution, mass communication revolution, digital revolution, biotech revolution, space travel revolution. That's where it becomes really interesting because, well, maybe you don't care about pirates after all, but you know, pirates, they always come up and start being very influential when things change and when things become very interesting for profit businesses. And this is not a coincidence at all. Now, if we look at this definition of piracy that we've just discussed, it does not overlap entirely with the common sense understanding of what is a pirate. It doesn't overlap at all with the United Nations definition of piracy. So this is what it includes, and this is what it excludes. So it captures very well 17th century sea piracy. It captures very well 20th century pirate radio. It captures very well organizations such as WikiLeaks or Anonymous, which are pirate organizations. It captures very well Mega Upload. Captures very well DIYBO, which is an organization. It's a collective of not-for-profit organizations. They're everywhere in the world. And it's people like, you would say, tech-savvy or geeks that really like tinkering with DNA and that believe that there should be no exclusive rights to tinker with DNA given to organizations like state organizations, research organizations, because they believe that our DNA belongs to us. And so they advocate for the right to just manipulate DNA, experiment with it on their own without having to be monitored by governments. So they can do some stuff that's pretty dangerous, obviously. And one of their big ideas is that you don't need a PhD in biology or biochemistry to be able to start cloning organisms or try to create new species by combining different types of DNA. So they have a claim against monopolies in that industry, well, in the biotech industry as well. So all those are pirate organizations. Now, what would not be pirate organizations are, for instance, Somali sea robbers. I call them sea robbers because they are not pirates according to this perspective in 2013. Why? Because the high seas are not anymore an uncharted territory. It took about 200 years, but nowadays there's like a series of conventions that have been ratified by all the countries in the world. And there's perfect consensus on the rules that should apply about value creation, value distribution, and value capture on the high seas. It's not uncharted territory anymore. It's as clear as land, what rules are applied in the high seas. And so whether you steal stuff on the sea or on land as a bank robber doesn't make any difference anymore. The high seas are not uncharted. So the Somali pirates are not pirates. They're just sea robbers. They're just like bank robbers. They're just operating on the water because it's more convenient to them, because they used to be fishermen, and they lost their job, and so they need money. Cyber theft, so like cyber criminals that would just use cyberspace as a means of transportation to steal credit card data and steal money from you, I wouldn't consider them to be pirate. Again, they could just rob a bank, but they just see cyber criminality as a higher return, lower risk opportunity. But they don't have any claims about how cyberspace should be regulated. They are not trying to fight any kind of monopoly. They don't have any problem with governments. They're just stealing from you. Now, what about illegal downloading? Well, I wouldn't consider that piracy as well, either, sorry. So these guys, they're very proactive. These guys, they're making sure that they're breaking digital locks, and they're making sure that content is available for free. And they have a value system to support that. They are very proactive in doing it because they oppose certain monopolistic systems. certain monopolistic arrangements. But the people that just free ride on the free content that's available online, that has been made available by Mega Upload, for instance, that do some illegal downloading, they're just free riding on the phenomena. They're passive downloaders. They don't necessarily have any political opinion or opinion at all about whether it's a good thing or a bad thing. It's just there, laying there. They're just picking it up. And putting people that download files illegally and the people that make sure those files are available in the same bag, it would be just like saying that Robinhood and the people that benefit from the redistribution of the stolen goods from Robinhood are just one and the same person. But it's not the case. There's Robinhood, and there's the people that free ride on what Robinhood has stolen. Okay, and that's not the same thing. Okay, so why should we care? Well, we should care because of this timeline. If you look at the pace at which these revolutions are happening, you see that it kind of accelerates. So the international trade revolution was a phenomenon that was quite sudden, but it took about 200 years, as I said, for nation states to agree on the rules that would apply on the high seas. And then for a while, there were no new major territorial expansion in capitalist societies. But since the beginning of the 20th century, you got all these new revolutions that are coming along, all these new territories that are being opened, explored, discovered, and it's happening more and more often. And the speed of change is faster and faster. So if I had been giving this very talk, like in the 16th century, I would have told you, don't worry about piracy. Chances are, by the end of your career, there won't be any other revolution happening. So you won't have to deal with pirates. But I'm giving this talk in 2013, and I'm just looking at the timeline, and our life expectancy has increased as well. And I would be very surprised if over a career of 50 years working for different businesses or working in any particular industry, you didn't have to face the pirate phenomenon at some point. Because it's just become massive, and it has just become repetitive, recurrent, and it's just touching so many different territories now upon which so many businesses depend that I don't think it's possible to just go through and do a career as a business executive for 50 years without having to think about those issues at some point. So if I try to put together some of the points that I've been trying to make tonight, I would define capitalism as a state-driven, discontinuous process of territorial expansion. Okay, so it's not a permanent process of change. It happens in waves when new territories are explored, discovered, usually because there's some new technology, so some technological improvement that allows for it. Monopolies are always used at times of expansion, always. And free trade is often the norm in between those waves of change. Sometimes people ask me, what is it that you do as a social scientist? What does it mean to be a social scientist? And I say, well, one good thing to do when you're a social scientist is to look for patterns, things that repeat over time. Once you've identified such patterns, it's probably, I mean, when it keeps happening, you start believing it's not random. And then that's when you start to look for explanations, and that's where you start to look for the mechanisms that underlie the phenomenon. So think about this. Monopolies are always part of the expansion mechanism, always. And actually, before the Dutch East India Company went to the Southeast Asia and started to impose a monopolistic form of trade there, the 3 centuries that preceded, free trade was the norm. So they replaced free trade by monopoly. It had always been free trade there. And then, when this happens, pirate organizations systematically contest the rules imposed by states and their monopolies. It's systematic. It has always happened, always. So that's another pattern that you can identify. If you look at the big picture, at the whole history of capitalism since the discovery of the Americas, this has always happened. Now, a feature that's kind of new, and that's, I think, quite interesting to spend some time on that, is the fact that nation states are less and less, or seem less and less capable of handling the rulemaking process. And that's because the nature of the territories we're talking about is changing. So when we were talking about land or the seas. States were usually looking for properties of their geographical environments, and they would use that to draw boundaries, to draw frontiers. So they would say, look, there's a mountain here, so that's going to separate your country and my country. Look, there's a river here, so the frontier is just going to follow the river. And that was fine. That made sense. It made it easy. When the territories were having all these particular features, physiological features, it made sense to use them to define boundaries. But now, if you're looking at ether, all these things in the air across which airwaves propagate, or if you're looking at cyberspace, there's no such things as mountains or rivers in cyberspace. So how do you define boundaries in cyberspace? Well, essentially, you cannot. And when nation states are trying to use the same old tricks that they use to define frontiers on land or on the seas, and they try to apply the same old tricks to territories that are essentially boundaryless, like cyberspace or the airwaves or DNA, it just doesn't work. And people get angry. So what I'm saying here is that the nation-state system is being less and less capable of handling the mutations of capitalism. It may even become obsolete in a lot sooner than we think. Another key point is that industry emergence and renewal is more and more affected by non-state actors. That's a direct implication of the previous point, especially by non-state actors such as pirate organizations. Because these organizations, as I said, they were in this box here, they're illegal, but they are legitimate. A lot of people support them. They get a lot of support from the broader civil society. I remember a survey that was conducted in France. I'm from France. Probably you heard that. Last year, it was at the end of 2011. It was a political survey, and people were asking about how popular they would judge each political party in France. And they had added WikiLeaks as one of the possible answers. WikiLeaks came on top. They had around 60% of the people supporting the actions of WikiLeaks in 2011. And the second best score was, I think, the left-wing Socialist Party, and they were below 30%. So there is a massive support for some of those pirate organizations. That's why I put them in this box there that says illegal but legitimate. And this is where change comes from, because they have the support of so many people. And so they're playing a role that's more, they are more and more influential in deciding how industries are shaped, how they emerge, which industries are obsolete, and how industries get renewed. If you think of the role of that pirate organizations had in the software industry or in the digital economy, just by looking at their impact on the development of the free software movement or the open source movement, it's massive. I'm going to go into some examples in a little bit. Another implication for business corporations is that I think it's important to switch the focus from how do I create, capture, and distribute value legally to how do I create, capture, and distribute value legitimately. I'm not saying you guys should do illegal stuff. I'm just saying this has become more important. Legitimacy has become more important than legality. Corporations such as the major record labels or the Hollywood studios, I've never done nothing illegal, or at least I'm not aware of it. But they have done a lot of things that have been judged illegitimate, and that's why they're collapsing. That's why they have downsized their workforce by 60% in the last 10 years, okay? And I could give a lot of examples in the pharmaceutical industry and other industries. I'm going to give a few examples, actually. So I think this should be the focus of strategy. If you want to take the long view and look at long-term strategy, if you're like, okay, I'm working in this industry, and I hope I can still work in this industry 40 years from now because I really like my job, then you should look at legitimacy patterns, not legal patterns. A few other implications of this is that there's some key features nowadays that have been identified by many groups, including management scholars, and that define business models that are essentially non-sustainable. Like, soon the party will be over if you do those kinds of things. And that's been identified in many industries. First, organizations that rely, businesses that rely excessively on territorial enclosure, zoning practices. They have been hurt a lot. So an example would be, okay, I'm a Hollywood studio, and I've got this really, really cool movie, and I'm going to release it. I'm investing like 200 million in marketing. And I'm releasing it in January in the United States, in March in Germany, in June in New Zealand, and if you're in India, too bad, you're going to have to wait until next year. That's a zoning practice. It cannot work anymore. You cannot spend 200 million on marketing in the age of cyberspace, in the age of YouTube, and expect that people are not going to want to see that really cool stuff that you've marketed before the day it's coming to you. If it's out somewhere, people want to see it everywhere, from anywhere. Okay, so zoning practices, most of the businesses that use that kind of practices are being hurt. Excessive knowledge enclosure. What I mean by that is, for instance, over-enforcing copyright. So I have been talking about piracy for quite a while, and I haven't used the word copyright a single time yet. So now is the time. I haven't used the word copyright, but I don't have to, because I use the word monopoly, and copyright is a monopoly. Okay, copyright, intellectual property, copyrights, patents, trademarks, essentially are monopoly rights. Okay, if you have a patent, I just invented this thing that I can flip slides, and that's really, oh no, I have a better idea. I just invented, I really like this one, the black, red, blue pen. Okay, I'm going to patent it because it's really awesome. And the deal essentially is, when I apply for a patent, I go before my government, before my sovereign, and I tell my sovereign, look, I've invented a really cool innovation, but I want to be able to make money out of it because I've been working really hard. I mean, it took me just a few seconds to assemble it, but it's been years of thinking. And I want to make some money out of it. And my sovereign tells me, look, JP, this is pretty cool. I would have never thought about that. And here's the deal. For 10 years, or 12 years, or how many, whatever years, for 10 years, you're going to have exclusive rights to sell the black, red, blue pen. But in exchange for this, you have to publicize the technology. Okay, because we want knowledge to be shared, we want knowledge to diffuse, and we want your work to be able to foster further innovation. So that is essentially the deal that you have with a copyright or with a patent, is that in exchange for the right to make money from your invention, you have to publicize that, publish the results, so that people can not reproduce it and make money out of it, at least not for 10 years, but they can benefit from the process to create new innovations on their own. Okay, that is the deal. But if you're over-enforcing those monopoly rights, essentially you're not diffusing enough of the knowledge, or you're preventing others from benefiting from your own innovations to slow down the pace of innovation, then the likelihood that pirates are going to be angry at you is very high nowadays. So more generally speaking, everything that slows down the diffusion of knowledge will hurt you. Sometimes I use the example of BlackBerry. They used to have a very strong competitive advantage, and they had a very good product. But their system was very proprietary. And one of the reasons why it didn't evolve as fast as competing systems, such as Android, for instance, if we talk about the software part, is because it was too enclosed. And it didn't attract enough developers, it didn't attract enough third parties, and it was improving, but not as fast as Android was improving because it was open source. Another feature that many businesses have relied upon in the last few years in certain industries, but it doesn't work, is to criminalize your customers, your consumers, or the users. So Hollywood studios or record labels have started playing the game of, I'm going to sue my consumers for downloading music illegally. They know that it's the same people that do a lot of illegal downloading and buy their products a lot. They know. They've got the market research, the same as everybody has. And yet they do it. And any management textbook, like Management 101 type of course, would tell you consumers are really important. You should always listen to the consumer. You should always pay attention to what they want. It doesn't say explicitly don't sue them, but I thought that was kind of implicit. That was part of the message. But some businesses are not doing that. And those are the businesses that are failing now. Another thing that is important to realize, and that many private corporations do not realize, is the fact that their competitors are their first natural allies. As you evolve into an industry, and you want to make sure that the way this industry operates is legitimate and so sustainable, you need to talk to your competitors, and you need to agree on a set of rules that is going to create value for the broader society to achieve this desired level of legitimacy. If you're being too individualistic and you are not talking to your competitors to design rules that are going to be suitable for the industry as a whole, then you're not going to come up with rules that are acceptable. That's in all likelihood. And so if you don't see that your competitors as your first allies when it comes to the legitimacy of the whole industry over time, then you're going to have some difficulties. And again, if you look at what happened in the music industry, they were not able to propose a common offer, put all their content, share all their content, put it on one website that would be convenient for people who wanted to purchase music legally online, because they were afraid that they were afraid to talk to each other because they were competitors. They were afraid that the content would be pirated. But in the end, they all did the same. They all created their website separately. And at the end of the day, the user thought, well, I'm not going to go to 5 different websites if I want to download music. So I'm going to go to Napster because it's all there. And keep an open eye and an open ear to external protest. If there's a lot of protests against, there's always protest. It cannot happen that everybody's going to be happy about what a particular company does or a particular industry does. Okay, so protest is normal. But when there's a massive amount of protest, a persistent wave of protest, don't disregard it. Listen to it and try to understand what is it that people don't find acceptable. And talk to your competitors about it. So all these things, they point towards one type of action. It's shifting the focus from business leadership to industry leadership. Realizing that competitors share a reputation commons in an industry. And that if you're doing something good, if your competitor is doing something good, something that people appreciate, it's going to have positive spillovers over you because it's going to enhance the reputation of the whole industry. I'm going to use a couple of recent examples. So I already introduced this particular example. The 4 major record labels couldn't agree on sharing their catalog, sharing their resources to give the consumer what the consumer wanted. They didn't want to talk to each other. They were afraid that they would try to rip each other off, and the dialogue was not established because they were competing with each other and not seeing each other as allies. What happened is Napster happened. They listened to what people wanted, and then they gave them what they wanted. So they put all these music catalogs available in one place that was conveniently available to anyone, and people started downloading that stuff. And that was a pirate organization that completely reshaped the music industry. And the cultural industries, generally speaking. It did one thing also that was very important in terms of changing the rules of the game, changing the norms of the industry, is that it got people accustomed to the idea that music could be purchased by the song and not by the album. So you didn't have, with Napster, you didn't have to download the whole 12-track album or pay for it even. You could just download just the songs that you liked. And that was already the case before. You could buy just the single, but it became the norm thanks to Napster. And there's one business corporation that sees this opportunity that was created by a pirate organization. It's Apple. They said to those guys, look, Napster is killing you, and we are not a competitor because we're not in the music industry. We're a neutral partner. We're really good guys. And we've got this brilliant idea that now people, they got used to downloading music song by song, and we're going to do that with your resources, with your catalog. Give us the key to the door, and we're going to open it for you. So the pirate organization in the story destroyed a lot of value in this industry. And a lot of value that was generated by the change in the rules of the game was captured by that guy, not those guys. And it's funny because Apple, this company has a very, if you look back at the origin of this corporation, there's a very nice story that I like to tell. So Steve Jobs, when he was a student, he wanted to put some money together to be able to start his company. And what he did is that he was actually fighting the monopoly of AT&T at the time. He said it was crazy that you had to pay so much to be able to phone people long distance in the US. And he thought it was really a shame that there was a monopoly in the telecommunication industry. So he was actually creating small devices that are a lot more innovative than this. They were called blue boxes. And with the blue box, you could actually bypass the payment system of AT&T. You could phone for free. So it was basically hacking into AT&T's network. And he was selling those devices on campuses, university campuses in California, making money out of that. And that's how he could spare some money and then invest in his first startup company. And when he did that, he actually bumped into some really nice software code that was written, the early version of BASIC, the BASIC software. And he thought, that's really nice, I'm going to use it. And I'm going to start developing my own code based on that thing that somebody else wrote. And one day, in the mid-70s, he got a letter by mail. He opened it. And essentially it said, hey, what are you doing? Are you using my code, like, without paying me? What the hell are you thinking? I mean, I worked really hard on this, and you're just, pirating my software code. And the letter was signed Bill Gates. And Steve Jobs didn't care in the 70s. And actually, in the early years of the Apple Corporation, he was insisting on having a pirate flag, the black flag, I'm going to show, well, you've seen it, on top of the headquarters. Because he was a pirate, and Apple was a pirate corporation. It changed over time, right? It became more and more proprietary and less open source. And that's an interesting feature of pirate organization, that pirate organizations of the past can become the monopolies of today or vice versa. Happens a lot. OK, so another thing that people ask me when I say that I'm a social scientist is, and usually I say, why do you say pff? Well, social science, it doesn't predict anything. It's useless because, math, physics, chemistry, you can predict what's going to happen. But social science, look at economics. You've got all these models and, centuries of work in economics, and they still can't predict the next crisis. And still, economics is like the king of the social sciences, right? Or the queen, I don't know. But still, we can't predict much with that. So I'm gonna take a big risk here, and I'm gonna make a prediction about the future in an industry that doesn't exist yet. I'm gonna call this the space mining industry. These are three businesses that operate in the space mining industry. So these are real corporations. Huh? SpaceX, you've probably heard about that one. Planetary Resources, it's been founded by Larry Page, Google founder Larry Page, and Microsoft's chief technology officer. That's funny. Monopolies of yesterday, investing in the monopolies of tomorrow. And this is Deep Space Impact. That's a company that's founded by Elon Musk. So what they want to do, essentially, they're all private corporations. They want to shape the contours of what is going to be the space travel and space mining industries. They don't exist yet. But they're the early movers. So they're gathering massive amounts of capital from really influential investors and very successful entrepreneurs, usually coming from the Googles and the Microsofts and the Twitters and the Apples. And what they want to do essentially is send private spaceships to the moon, to Mars, and to asteroids, and start mining natural resources of those extraterrestrial bodies, and then sell them. OK? Now, if I ask you, can you do that? Is it legal? Can you go on the moon, mine resources, go back to Earth, and sell them to people, countries, governments? Is that legal? Well, we don't know. It's uncharted territory. Is that legitimate? We don't know either. What about asteroids? I mean, people care about the moon. You know, we look at it; it's beautiful. We only see one side. It's nice. But what about asteroids? People don't care about asteroids. So maybe it's fine if you do it on asteroids. But we don't know for sure. What we know is that there's, again, these guys from the United Nations. As I said, every time there's something I don't know, I go and look in their huge conventions. It's really interesting. Also, if I can't fall asleep, it's very useful. They have a really, it's my favorite book by the United Nations. I recommend you read it. It's called the Outer Space Treaty. It was written in 1967, in the middle of the Cold War, so it makes it, yeah, it's really fancy. They talk about James Bond and stuff like that. And it says basically that in the near future, people are going to start trying to do stuff outside of Earth. And, but everything that's outside of Earth, everything that's extraterrestrial, I'm never going to be able to pronounce that word, sorry, actually is declared the common heritage of mankind. It's actually the same expression that is used for the high seas, and that's used for cyberspace. Okay, common good of mankind or common heritage of mankind. So it's all in this Outer Space Treaty from 1967. But then the treaty says that the fact that the moon's resources and the asteroids' resources and all these resources are recognized the common heritage of mankind prevents their appropriation by any sovereign entity. You cannot appropriate it if you're a sovereign entity. But it doesn't say anything about private appropriation. There's nothing about what if you're a private corporation? Can you do it? Can you not do it? It's not in the treaty. It only prevents sovereign entities from doing it. So essentially, and that's, again, that's a prediction. I'm probably going to be wrong. These organizations have spotted this loophole in the treaty and are probably going to try to, and they're supporting, so they're all, in the US, they're supported by NASA. They're actually working with NASA. And their plan is by 2030 to be on the moon, to be on asteroids, mining off resources that are common heritage of mankind, and then sell them. And so my prediction is that if this is how it's going, if they're not asking anyone if that's legal or legitimate, my prediction is that before we're dead, we're going to see space pirates. You're going to have private organizations that are going to fight those guys, and that are going to do exactly what sea pirates did against the Dutch East India Company, what pirate radio stations did against the BBC, what Anonymous or WikiLeaks today are doing against monopolies on the internet. Now, I'm going to show you a few unexpected ties between people, corporations. So this is the co-founder of Napster, Sean Parker, and he became the first president of Facebook Corporation. Again, people change jobs as individuals, but I don't care about that. But sometimes it's just funny to notice certain patterns. Oh, that's another one that I like a lot. So WikiLeaks, it's a pirate organization. And sometimes it happens that pirate organizations ally with nation states. And WikiLeaks has struck an agreement with Iceland. This is the Icelandic flag. I didn't know until today, but I looked it up. And the agreement essentially is Iceland asked for WikiLeaks to help them redesign a convention for civil liberties, the information, some sort of Freedom Information Act, and design a charter to regulate freedom of speech on the internet. So now WikiLeaks is collaborating with the government to actually reshape policy, public policy, drawing from the values that WikiLeaks has been advocating in the past. But the US government didn't like that so much, and so there's this, it's brand new. It's like it came out in the news a couple of days ago. But it happened 3 years ago. It was just classified information, and it just revealed it. That FBI agents, when this was first revealed, this partnership between WikiLeaks and Iceland was revealed, FBI agents were sent in a covert operation to Iceland and to investigate, and they violated the sovereignty of Iceland because the operation was not, the government in Iceland was not aware of it, so they violated the sovereignty with the government. And the government found out in Iceland and they kicked out the FBI agents. So now Iceland and the US are in a very tense diplomatic situation because of that. Now I'm going to show you two unexpected statements. This one is from Julian Assange in an interview to Forbes magazine. I'll let you read it. So what is very interesting here is the fact that Julian Assange is putting his finger on the fact that capitalism and free markets are essentially different things. Okay? And he's saying that he's not too fond of capitalism, but he loves free markets. And that's one thing that is really puzzling about what pirate organizations do, is that in many instances, if you look back at history, you find them defending principles such as free trade, free markets, free circulation against the authorities of capitalism. Okay? An implication of that, if you accept this distinction between free trade, free markets, and capitalism, and you accept that capitalism is essentially a social system that is driven by nation states, you will see that it can have some very interesting political implications as well. So for instance, in the United States, there's a political movement that was born there, but it has spread. It's called anarcho-capitalism. So it's the idea that capitalism pushed to its ultimate implications, ultimate consequences, should be without a state. That we don't need the state. All the functions of the state could be privatized. But if you look at history, it doesn't make any sense. Capitalism is a system centered around the state. So trying to imagine a society that would be called capitalism and that would have no state is a contradiction in terms. Now, this is a very recent statement by Kim.com, who was the founder of Mega Upload, went to jail, went out of jail, and now just relaunched a new service called Mega, and that's an interview to The Guardian. So here, what I found really interesting is, so I was saying a word about the fact that the nation-state system was likely to become obsolete to deal with the recent mutations of capitalism, and that's something that Kim.com seems to point to as well, because he's referring to the United Nations as some supranational authority that is more important things to look at than the particular rules that governments are trying to implement. And so he's looking at the supranational level to defend what he's doing, to justify what he's doing against particular governments. And that is if you look at the tensions across the world today, this is a recurrent pattern. If you look at the situation in Europe, there's been this idea for the last decades that we should move to the supranational level, and that the nation states had become irrelevant in Europe, and that the European Union at the supranational level should gain more power, because it would solve a lot of the collective action problems that European countries are having. A lot of people agree with that, but since the crisis, people have changed their minds and are going back to some kind of nationalistic sentiment. But if you look at the big issues of today, whether it is natural resource depletion, climate change, regulation of cyberspace, those are all issues that need to be dealt with at the level of humankind. These are not the issues of any particular nation state or any particular government. And so the idea that these problems need to be solved at a supranational level makes sense and is not new. And that's this very same idea that Kim.com is referring to here. And he's also saying something about copyright extremism. Now I want to say a few words, and that's the last slide, or almost, about the project. Because so this is the Pirate organization is not just a book. It's a lot of things, and it's an open project and an open community that has been going from a book in French to many other things. So it started as a book in French in 2010, but the research project itself with my co-authors started in 2005. I actually wrote my master's thesis in economics on capitalism and piracy. When we published this book in French, we had the idea to, we didn't want to speak to the academic community, or not just to the academic community. We wanted to break the boundaries between the university and the rest of society, because what's the point in just talking to 300 other researchers that work on the same topic across the world, writing a whole book for 300 people. That's what we do when we publish scholarly articles, but sometimes it's a bit frustrating, and we believe it's the role also of universities to speak to the broader civil society. So we were thinking about how we could do that, how we could reach out to a broader audience. So we had this weird idea, I guess, to team up with an experimental rock band. And we asked that rock band to compose a song that is called the Pirate Organization, and that was published in Creative Commons license. So it has no, well, it has a copyright, but it's a very open sort of copyright. And the production of the song was funded from our royalties as authors. So we basically used our royalties to pay the band. And the song came out at the same time as the book, and can be downloaded, remixed, and actually all the soundtrack that you heard in the movie was that song and remixes of the song that were sent to us by readers of the book, and that were uploaded on our website. Okay, so it's all Creative Commons. It can all be downloaded, freely modified, hacked, remixed, whatever. There was just this one loop of 2 seconds that was not from the original music. So we did this, and then so the publishing house we had in France is very small. It has one permanent employee. It's a very small publishing house that publishes only social science. And we were hoping that we would be able to have a translation of the book in English. But in the meanwhile, we had a lot of work because we got a lot of feedback on the French version of the book, which was a very different version than the one you have here. It had a lot of, it had 2 chapters about the philosophical foundations of the project, which were drawing a lot on the works of a French philosopher called Gilles Deleuze. This is all gone. Well, most of it is gone in the English version. But we got a lot of feedback, and we wanted to change a lot of things. So essentially, the English translation is not just a translation. It's a brand new version of the book with lots of updates and lots of things that have been changed thanks to all the feedback we got. But anyway, we were contacted by a much bigger publishing house this time because they heard about this project with the band, and they thought it was interesting. And there was quite some media attention about it. There was the Financial Times wrote a lengthy piece that was called Rock and Roll and Research, and they were asking us why the hell would business professors collaborate with an experimental rock band to write a book about piracy? And I'm not sure I have the answer to that question if I look back. But that was fun. So we had this book coming out in English, and we already had the music and the remixes, and then we were thinking, okay, this time how are we going to reach out to a broader audience? And I thought, okay, why not a movie? After all, the music is only instrumental. It actually doesn't tell any story, so it doesn't explain what the book is about. And we thought with making a short movie would be more appropriate to tell people what the book is about. So I got some external funding from the Canadian government to do that, actually. So I produced the movie this year, hired a director, and the movie came out. It's also entirely in a Creative Commons license, so it can be downloaded, remixed, it can be circulated, there's no restrictions, and it only uses music that's also published under Creative Commons. And the subtitles of the movie are available in 12 languages. So if you want to send it to your friends that only speak Turkish or Korean or Japanese or Latvian even, it's fine. The subtitles are up there. So then we have this website, pirateorganization.com. It's got a blog, and it's got a lot of stuff. So you can find the movie, you can find the song, you can find lots of information, you can find links to many things that are freely downloadable. Like we have more academic papers based on the book that are all freely accessible there and that kind of summarized certain aspects of the book in 20 pages, 30 pages, and we're trying to cover different topics. And then we blog about a variety of issues. I say we because we're a whole team now. We have partnerships with organizations. So I can tell you about the latest one we had. It's a private business. It's the European leader in business process outsourcing. I won't say the name of the company because it's irrelevant. But the CEO of the company read the book in French and thought it was interesting. And the way he thought about it, the way he interpreted some of the findings of the book is, he said, at some point, if I want my employees to keep innovating, to keep developing new products and new services for our customers, we have to change the rules of the game as well. He thought there was a very strong connection between how you work and what you can do with the way you work. And he said at some point, if we want disruptive innovation, we're going to have to change the way we are organized, the way the management processes that we use. And so to do that, he said, I'm going to create a space for my employees that is blank, a blank space with no rules, where the rules of the company don't apply. So he purchased a big warehouse that was empty next to the company's headquarters, and he called that the pirate space. And essentially, the employees of that company, it opened 2 months ago, so we had a little event, and he invited my co-author and I to go and give a talk to the company's employees and to the biggest customers of the company as well. And we were debating about how the ideas of the book were being translated into that pirate space. And so we talked with some of the employees that were actually going there. And so it was the headquarters, so it was only actually executives, high-ranking executives of the company that were going there very often because it was next to the headquarters. So they started with several projects where basically they do exactly the opposite of what they would do in their regular working day. And they started creating some collective biological, how to say, they're growing biological vegetables, and they have a garden where they try to develop new rules of collaboration in a much more autonomous way and in a much more there is no hierarchy, it's very flat. And so they try to experiment with new ways of organizing their work and their labor and see what comes out of this. So that's one example, but there are others. So we're working with private organizations as well. And that is kind of new. So my co-author, Rodolphe Durand, he's a professor of strategy at HEC Paris, another business school. And so 3 years ago, we started working on an elective course that's called Managing Public and Private Interests. And we started teaching it there. And it's still going on, and it's quite a success. And this year, I just proposed to create a similar course at Ivey. And it just got accepted, so it's going to happen next year. I'm going to start teaching it in January 2014. And it's going to be, the title of the course is The Dark Side of Capitalism. So it will not just be about piracy, it will be about, it will be about how industries emerge, get reshaped, get renewed, and what is the role of these organizations in the 3 cells that no one looks at on industry renewal. So I will be teaching that in the HBA2 program. And then we have a Twitter account at pirate.org. We have a Facebook page, and we connect all these elements together. So I'm not the one who's like tweeting there. I just want to say Ivey's not paying me to tweet or stuff like that. I got external funding for that. So I'm working with a research assistant, David Jackson, who's the community manager of the website, and he's the one that's tweeting there and doing a great job connecting with people, reaching out. So, yeah, if you want to contribute to the project, if you want to send us some remarks, if you want to share ideas, you can use any of those channels to reach out to us. And that shall be the end for today, before the Q&A. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you for the Ivey team for putting this event together. It's been a pleasure. And I am going to be very careful about what you're going to say now, because as I said, the project is an open project. It keeps changing, it keeps evolving, and every piece of feedback is really helpful, really useful, and we do take it into account very much. So So I'm looking forward to your questions and remarks and comments. Thank you.